course, they're sportsmen, not soldiers.
Hollywood has always had a complicated relationship with women who take up too much space. Not emotionally, physically. Brigitte Nielsen walked onto a film set in 1985, 6'1", sharp features, built like she belonged in the ring, not on someone's arm. Red Sonja, Rocky IV, Cobra, 3 films in 2 years, and in each of them, the same tension. What do you do with a woman who physically dominates the frame? Let's peel it back. Brigitte Nielsen was born on July 15, 1963, in Rodovre, a quiet suburb on the outskirts of Copenhagen. Her father, Sven, was an engineer. Her mother, Hanna, was a librarian. It was a stable, unremarkable Danish childhood, swimming, schoolwork, a stint working in a local bakery. There were no early signs of Hollywood ambition, no childhood pageants, no stage mother pushing her toward the spotlight. But there was one thing that set her apart from the beginning, and it was the same thing that would define nearly every phase of what came next: her height. By the time she was a teenager, Nielsen was already towering over most of the people around her. In Denmark, that might have made her slightly unusual. In the fashion industry, it made her exactly what people were looking for. At 16, she left home to pursue modeling. That might sound dramatic now, but in the European fashion world of the late 70s and early 80s, it was a well-worn path for girls who had the proportions the industry wanted, and Nielsen had them in abundance. She moved between Milan, Paris, Berlin, and New York. She worked with Gianni Versace. She worked with Giorgio Armani. She worked with Gianfranco Ferré. She was photographed by Helmut Newton and Greg Gorman, 2 of the most significant fashion photographers of the era. These were not small credits. She was operating at a high professional level before anyone ever thought of putting her in front of a movie camera, and that matters more than it usually gets acknowledged. Modeling at that tier means something specific. It means she understood image making before she ever set foot on a soundstage. She understood how light works. She understood posture. She understood how to hold a frame and let the camera do its job. She understood that presence is a craft, not an accident. These are things that people tend to dismiss when they talk about models who become actors, as though the 2 disciplines have nothing to teach each other. But they do, particularly for someone like Nielsen, whose physicality would become the central fact of her screen career. That background in high fashion was not a footnote. It was the foundation. In 1983, at the age of 20, she married the Danish musician Kasper Winding. Their son Julian was born the following year. The marriage was brief, ending by 1984, and almost immediately after, the call came from Italy. The next chapter was about to begin, and it would move at a speed that left very little room for anyone, including Nielsen herself, to fully understand what was happening. The transition from modeling to film happened almost by accident. The Italian producer Dino De Laurentiis saw her on the cover of a magazine and invited her to audition in Rome for a role he was casting. The film was Red Sonja, a sword and sorcery fantasy picture co-starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. Nielsen had no formal acting training. She was 21 years old, and she walked into that audition and walked out with the lead in a Hollywood-backed action picture. Just like that. Red Sonja, released in 1985, was not a critical success. It was campy and uneven, the kind of mid-80s genre film that lives somewhere between earnest spectacle and cheerful absurdity. The reviews were mixed at best, but Nielsen's physical presence in the film was genuinely undeniable. She looked like she belonged in the frame with Schwarzenegger, which was not something many performers could claim. She didn't play the love interest who needed rescuing. She was the warrior, the title character. The camera didn't diminish her. If anything, it emphasized just how unusual she was. Not just tall, but commanding, angular, fierce in a way the genre hadn't quite seen from a woman before. That same year, during the promotional tour for Red Sonja, she met Sylvester Stallone. Within months they were together. By December 1985, they were married. She was 22. He was 39. And by the time they exchanged vows, she was already appearing in Rocky IV as Ludmila Drago, the ice-cold Soviet wife of Dolph Lundgren's Ivan Drago. In 1986, She starred alongside Stallone again in Cobra, playing a model targeted by a murderous cult. That's 3 major studio films in roughly 2 years, all of them anchored by the biggest action stars of the decade. The trajectory was steep and, by any measure, extraordinary. But here's what's worth sitting with. Look at those 3 roles in sequence. In Red Sonja, Nielsen was the physical spectacle, the woman who could hold a sword and look like she meant it. In Rocky IV, she was the ornamental antagonist, beautiful, rigid, framing Drago's menace with her own kind of glacial severity. In Cobra, she was the endangered beauty, a target who needed Stallone's protection to survive. Each role used her differently, but none of them asked her to be ordinary. None asked her to be soft or vulnerable in a way that felt psychologically real. And none of them asked her to do the kind of interior, emotionally layered work that builds a long career in American film. In 1987, she played Carla Fry in Beverly Hills Cop 2, directed by Tony Scott, opposite Eddie Murphy. It was a villain role, and she was effective in it, sleek, menacing, glamorous in that particular late 80s way. She brought a coiled energy to the part, but once again, it was a role defined almost entirely by her exterior, her look, her stature, the geometry of her face and body. The character existed to be visually impressive and to be defeated. That was the beginning and the end of it. This is the pattern that took shape early and never quite loosened its grip. Brigitte Nielsen was one of the most visually striking performers of her era, and the industry treated that as both her greatest asset and her most confining limitation. The more memorable she looked, the less anyone seemed interested in discovering what she could do beyond looking memorable. It's a trap that Hollywood sets for certain performers, particularly women, and particularly women whose appearance doesn't conform to conventional softness. They become their own image, and the image becomes a ceiling. Think about what was being asked of the leading women in 80s action cinema. Typically, the role was supportive. You were there to humanize the male lead, to give him something to protect, something to fight for. Your job was to be in peril, so he could be heroic. Nielsen, by sheer force of her physical presence, short-circuited that dynamic. You could not put her in a room with Stallone and have the audience believe she needed saving. The camera simply wouldn't sell that story. So instead, she was positioned as the adversary, the ice queen, the beautiful obstacle. That was the only slot the industry could find for a woman who took up that much visual space. And while it made for striking images, it was never going to sustain an American film career on its own. The turning point is difficult to isolate because it wasn't a single moment. It was a convergence of several things happening at once. Her marriage to Stallone ended in 1987, after just 19 months. The divorce was tabloid gold, intense, personal, kind of public unraveling that defined celebrity culture in the 80s. Allegations flew in both directions. Suddenly, in public imagination, Nielsen went from being the towering woman on Stallone's arm to being the towering woman Stallone had discarded. That's a brutal recalibration of public identity, and it happened with tremendous speed. At the same time, the Hollywood machine that had produced her early roles was shifting underneath her feet. The mid-80s action boom, the era that had generated Rocky IV, Cobra, Red Sonja, Commando, all those high-concept, big-body genre pictures, was beginning to evolve. By the late 80s and into the 90s, Hollywood shifted. Action got slicker. The space for someone like Nielsen got smaller. This isn't about failure. It's about timing. She stayed the same. The industry didn't. By the 90s, roles for women were narrowing, and there wasn't a clear box to put her in. The call slowed, not because she disappeared, but because the system moved on. After Beverly Hills Cop 2, Nielsen moved to Europe. She hosted Italian television programs, including the Variety Show Festival in 1987 and, notably, the 1992 edition of the Sanremo Music Festival, one of the biggest television events in Italy. She recorded a dance album, Everybody Tells a Story, in 1987. She recorded a duet with the Austrian pop star Falco, a Giorgio Moroder track called Body Next to Body that reached the top 10 in Austria and charted in Germany. She worked across multiple countries and multiple languages, building a career in markets that most American audiences never see. She also continued to act. Through the early and mid-90s, she took roles in lower-budget genre films, 976 Evil 2, The Double O Kid, Chained Heat 2, Galaxis. These were not prestige projects. They were B-movies and direct-to-video fare. But they were work, steady work, and she kept doing it. She starred as the Black Witch in the Italian television fantasy series Fantaghiro, beginning in 1992. The character was originally meant to be killed off, but was brought back by popular demand. The show ran through 1996, 4 years of consistent, audience-approved work in a market that valued her presence. The American tabloid narrative rarely accounts for any of this. It prefers the simpler version. She was famous, then she wasn't. She was on the red carpet, then she was gone. But that isn't really what happened. What happened was that she left one market and found others. She moved laterally, not downward. The visibility in America dimmed, absolutely. But the work continued. The career kept moving. The early 2000s brought a new chapter, and it's the one that tends to dominate casual conversation about her. Nielsen appeared on the 3rd season of VH1's The Surreal Life in 2004. She appeared on Celebrity Big Brother in the UK in January 2005, where she placed 3rd and shared the house with her former mother-in-law, Jackie Stallone, a detail that felt almost too strange for fiction. She had a widely publicized relationship with the rapper Flavor Flav, which was filmed for the VH1 series Strange Love that same year. She later appeared on Flavor of Love. In 2008, she appeared on Celebrity Rehab with Dr. Drew, where she publicly addressed her struggle with alcoholism. It would be easy to be dismissive about this stretch of her career, and many people have been. Reality television in the mid-2000s was broadly treated as a punchline, especially for celebrities who had originally been famous for something else entirely. But there's another way to read this period. Nielsen was visible again. She was working. She was earning a living. And she was doing something that very few performers from her era were willing to do. She was showing up as herself, unscripted, without the armor of a character or a director's vision to hide behind. That takes a kind of nerve that doesn't get enough credit, especially for someone whose entire early career had been built on image, on being the impossibly statuesque figure in the designer gown, the untouchable presence filling the frame. To pivot from that to the raw, sometimes humiliating transparency of reality television requires either desperation or a genuine lack of vanity. With Nielsen, it honestly always seemed like something closer to the second. She didn't seem ashamed of the absurdity. She leaned into it. She let people see her in contexts that most former action stars would have avoided at any cost. And there's something oddly brave about that. Even if the vehicle itself felt disposable, there's also a practical dimension worth noting. By the mid-2000s, European television market was evolving too. Reality programming was booming globally. Nielsen's willingness to appear on these shows kept her in the public conversation in a way that quietly selective art house roles would not have. In a business that runs on visibility, she chose to remain visible. You can question the venue, but you cannot question the strategy. And then there's Celebrity Rehab. That was different from the rest. In 2008, she appeared on the 1st season, openly discussing her struggle with alcohol. That wasn't a game show or a dating competition. That was something closer to a public reckoning, televised in ways that were often uncomfortable to watch. Whatever you think of that show's ethics or format, Nielsen's presence on it was notable because it represented something the tabloid press had always wanted from her: vulnerability, confession, the cracks in the surface. And she offered it on her own terms, within a framework she had chosen. That distinction matters. In 2009, she published an autobiography in Scandinavia. The Danish title translates roughly to "You Only Have One Life." This is how I found myself again. It reached the top 5 of Denmark's bestseller list and was later published in English under the title "You Only Get One Life." She continued working in European television through the 2010s, appearing on competition shows, hosting programs, staying present in markets that still found her interesting. In 2012, she won the German edition of I'm a Celebrity. Get Me Out of Here. She was not retreating. She was adapting. Then, in 2018, something genuinely unexpected happened. She was invited to reprise the role of Ludmila Drago in Creed II. 33 years after Rocky IV, she walked back into the franchise that had helped launch her career. The return was kept secret during production. Even Dolph Lundgren reportedly didn't know she would be in the film until she showed up on set. When the movie premiered, her appearance was the kind of surprise that gave the audience a jolt of recognition. A thread from 1985 pulled taut across 3 decades and suddenly made visible again. In the film, Ludmila is no longer Ivan Drago's loyal Soviet wife. She has left him. She has moved on to a life of wealth and status, abandoning both her ex-husband and their son Victor after Ivan's loss to Rocky Balboa destroyed their standing. It is a small role, but a loaded one. The character is cold, self-preserving, calculating, and Nielsen plays her with a restraint that feels earned by decades of life experience. There's a scene where Ludmila appears at a boxing match, poised and untouchable, watching from a distance. She does not say much. She does not need to. The weight of the character is carried entirely in how Nielsen occupies the frame. Still commanding, still angular, still impossible to ignore. It is a performance built on presence, which is what she has always done best. She filmed those scenes while 7.5 months pregnant with her 5th child, a daughter named Frida, who was born in June 2018. Nielsen was 54 years old. Her height, she later noted, helped conceal the pregnancy on camera. There is something quietly remarkable about that detail. The very thing that had always set her apart. The body that had been cataloged and categorized and made spectacle of for decades, quietly doing her a practical favor on a film set 3 decades after it first drew the camera's attention. Brigitte Nielsen's influence is not the kind that gets talked about in awards retrospectives or career tribute montages. It is subtler than that and more structural. She was one of the first women in mainstream Hollywood action cinema to be cast not because she was small and in need of protection, but because she was physically imposing and capable of holding the screen alongside the biggest male stars of the decade. She stood toe-to-toe with Schwarzenegger in Red Sonja. She matched Stallone's frame in Rocky IV. She didn't shrink. In an era that generally liked its women either ornamental or imperiled, that was a genuinely unusual thing to see. You can draw a line, however faint, from what Nielsen represented in the mid-'80s to the kinds of physically commanding women who would later find space in action cinema. The industry didn't know what to do with her then, but the template she helped create, the woman who looks like she could actually win the fight, the woman whose body is an asset rather than something to be rescued from danger, didn't evaporate. It just took a long time for the culture to catch up with it. It's also worth acknowledging that Nielsen carved out something genuinely rare, a career that spans continents, languages, and mediums. She worked in America, in Italy, in Denmark, in Germany, in the United Kingdom. She speaks 6 languages. She adapted to different audiences, different television cultures, different professional expectations. That kind of fluidity doesn't receive enough credit, partly because American media tends to treat anything that happens outside the Hollywood system as irrelevant. But it isn't irrelevant. It's a form of professional survival that most performers never achieve. And there's something to be said for longevity itself, separate from the question of prestige. Nielsen has been a working performer for 4 decades. She has outlasted trends, eras, entire models of the entertainment business. She was working when action stars still shot on film. She was working when reality television was invented. She was working when streaming took over. She kept working through all of it. That kind of persistence is its own statement, even when it goes unrecognized. Today, Brigitte Nielsen lives in the United States with her husband, Mattia Desi, an Italian model and bartender whom she married in 2006. She is a mother of 5 children. In December 2023, she walked the runway for Balenciaga's Fall 2024 show in Los Angeles. In February 2025, she walked for Squared 2 at Milan Fashion Week alongside Naomi Campbell. She attended the Red Cross Ball in Monaco in July 2025. At 62 years old, she is still working, still showing up, still unmistakably the tallest woman in every room she enters. She has not announced a retirement. She has not issued any grand statement about her legacy or what it all meant. She has simply continued to be present in whatever form the work takes, a runway, a red carpet, a screen, without apology and without explanation. So what do we make of Brigitte Nielsen? The standard version of the story is convenient and tidy. Model marries action star, makes a few films, gets divorced, fades away, turns up on reality TV. But that version requires you to ignore decades of steady work across multiple countries and languages, a best-selling autobiography, a return to the franchise that started it all, and a late-career fashion renaissance that most performers half her age would envy. The real story is messier and far more interesting. It is about a woman who was given a very narrow kind of visibility, spectacle, surface, type, and who spent the rest of her career finding other ways to be seen. Not always gracefully, not always on her own terms, but persistently, stubbornly, with a kind of durability that the people who dismissed her 20 or 30 years ago probably did not expect. There's a version of this story in which Nielsen is a cautionary tale. The model who married the star, the foreigner who got chewed up by the machine, the tabloid fixture who couldn't sustain the heat. But that version only works if you stop paying attention after 1987. If you keep watching, the story changes shape entirely. It becomes something closer to a study in endurance, and what it looks like when someone refuses to accept the narrative the industry has written for them, even when the alternative paths are less glamorous and the rooms are smaller. Hollywood asked her to be an image, a surface, a type, and for a while she was. But the image kept moving. It kept finding new rooms to walk into, new cameras to stand in front of, new versions of itself to offer. That is not a disappearance. It is not a comeback. It is just a career, long, lateral, stubbornly alive. And it is still going. Maybe that's the most interesting thing about her. Not the roles she played or the marriages the tabloids dissected or the headlines she outlasted. It's that she never stopped being willing to be looked at, even when the gaze was unkind, even when it was dismissive, even when it was the wrong kind of attention entirely. She stayed in frame, and eventually, the frame had to adjust to her. If this one made you think, I'd love to hear what you took from it in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is the kind of thing we do here. Thanks for watching.